So GPI, it's a research institute at Oxford, interdisciplinary between economics and philosophy. And the guiding question that it's trying to address is, with a given unit of resources, how can we use those resources to do as much good as possible? Should be a very familiar question if you're at this conference. So in terms of kind of why we're doing this, I think there's kind of three long-term kind of paths to impact, each of which I think are kind of really important. One is just in terms of pure academic credibility for kind of EA movement as a whole. If you look through kind of past examples of very influential ideas, it does seem the case that kind of universities and the intellectual elite are super important. So a couple of stories either way. On the negative side, Eric Drexler's development of the idea of atomically precise manufacturing, or what he used to call nanotechnology, really went hard on public outreach, building up kind of ideas outside of the university, even perhaps snubbing the universities a little bit. This meant that when these ideas had really taken hold, the US government was deciding whether to put $3 billion towards research in this area. The US government then turns to those who have a kind of monopoly on intellectual, certain sort of intellectual mainstream. They say, well, where should this money go? And the term switches from nanotechnology, meaning nanomachines, to nanoparticles. Think of the difference between a watch and a stone. And Eric Drexler gets kind of very sidelined. And it's at least arguable that if he'd spent more time kind of really engaging with the universities, showing this was scientifically respectable, that story could have been very different. Story on the other side is the free marketeers, Hayek and Friedman and so on. They spent decades really developing these ideas in economics and other fields before then going more mainstream through think tanks and then the wider public. And that was just astonishingly successful because it means whole generations of people have grown up believing certain things because that's just science, that's economics. If you ever read an economics textbook as a philosopher, that's extremely slanted in certain directions. But they were kind of extremely effective there. So that's kind of one path to impact. A second is just purely in terms of getting certain ideas out there, where by building these ideas in academia, that gets taught to students and so on. I'm sure many of us have got into these ideas via reading Peter Singer as an undergraduate. I certainly did. And then a third path to impact is just figuring out things that we don't know. Left us to the end, but it's maybe the most important. I genuinely think there's tons of stuff I'm incredibly uncertain about, and very major decisions and what I would think is most important would depend on often quite theoretical issues on which I have beliefs. And then in terms of how GPI is doing the sort of research compared to other organizations and institutions, it's taking the kind of academic approach very seriously. So that's often much, much slower than writing a blog post or something, but hopefully at least to a very high degree of rigor as well. So you can imagine maybe there's kind of the bleeding edge of EA thought at the moment, which has gone kind of very quickly over 10 different major infant steps or something. We feel pretty confident about them all, maybe 90% confidence about each of these infant steps. But it should sure be extremely valuable to do this very slow process of going through each of those infant steps to have a very high degree of confidence. Because, well, even for those 9 out of 10 where they're very well supported, I think it's still good to really understand why. And then for the 1 out of 10 things that we believe but aren't true, well, on the fundamental matters, that can be extremely important indeed. So in terms of kind of our operation, at the moment where we are primarily philosophers, so we're aiming to be philosophy and economics with about equal emphasis, it is the case that we've just, within philosophy, this stuff has felt very much like pushing on an open door. It's been a little bit harder within economics. So we have 5 full-time researchers, within philosophy and 2 part-time researchers within economics. So we clearly do have a big slant there. But we're hoping to kind of expand our representation in economics more over the next couple of years. As well as just hiring people to do this work, we also are trying to bring in a lot of people, build a kind of community and network for people who are interested in global priorities research. So we have a visitors program for graduate students and senior academics. And that happens in what Oxford calls Trinity term, but like May, June, July kind of time. We also are just very keen on collaborations with academics and other researchers around the world as well. One thing we should say and emphasize a lot is we are hiring both researchers and on the operational side. So the position we're hiring most for at the moment is a head of research operations, kind of the equivalent of a COO. And I'm confident there's really strong candidates in this audience at the moment. Then we're also looking for postdoctoral hires. We're looking for people who want to come and do a PhD at Oxford, and possibly senior researchers as well. And yeah, we're planning to build out the team quite significantly over the next 4 or 5 years. So that's kind of what we are and what we aim to do. In terms of our research, so we've got this overarching question. This is why we're aiming to do what we're aiming to do, which is, with a given unit of resources, how do you do as much good as possible? At GPI, we're particularly interested in what we call the long-termism paradigm as a response to that, where the idea is long-termism defined as the primary determinant of the moral value of the actions we take today, how those actions influence the very long run. Well, if this is true, then you've got this really large space of possible things you could do with a given unit of resources. And then at least you've got a kind of paradigm for answering that initial question. You can drastically cut down the space of interventions you're looking at those that plausibly influence the very long run future. So we're interested in engaging kind of critically with this idea, whether how well supported is this by different kind of model views, economic models, and if so, what follows from it as well. Does it immediately follow that it's existential risk that we should be most concerned about, or is it something that improves the world conditional on survival, or is it something else again? I should say the people in terms of the researchers we have are, generally we are engaged on thinking about some of these long-termist focused issues, but there's varying degrees of skepticism about whether that actually holds. It's also the case that we have a significant number of non-consequentialists, including Andreas, who will hopefully make it on the bus. You'd think the non-consequentialist would be the one to keep his promise and turn up on time. But he is also the most philosophical of us all, so maybe it kind of balances out. So to give a kind of just a little overview of some of our research, we'll go into these two two topics in kind of more depth. But some of the stuff we've been working on. So one is this idea of indirect effects. So if I give one deworming treatment in Kenya and one in India, at the moment on the way that, say, GiveWell would assess that, it's basically the same. I mean, there's still some differences given rates of worm infections and so on, but basically treat it the same. But the long-run effects of those two interventions are going to be extremely different. They're going to be different in terms of what the population growth rate is, the economic growth rate, how much meat people consume, and so on. And at the moment, in cost-effectiveness analysis, that's all kind of ignored. So we've been doing some work on, again, on the kind of more philosophical side of making the case for thinking, well, you should take these indirect effects into account in the same way you can't take the short-run effects. But also, and then also arguing that when we look at the very long run, it's much harder to have certain kind of non-consequential. people like Angus Deaton sometimes criticize development-focused EA for not looking at indirect, possibly harmful effects. And they often actually argue that that you shouldn't just treat the harms and the benefits in the same way. It's just worse to do harm than it is good to do benefit. And they say often, therefore, it's not really clear whether it is morally good to engage in these aid projects at all. What our paper argues is just, if you have that view where there's this harm-benefit asymmetry, then because our actions are having these huge long-run effects all the time, it means that the best thing that you could do, in fact, the only thing you're permitted to do would just be to remain motionless, perhaps starve to death. I really wanted to call this paper Why Non-Consequentialists Should All Kill Themselves, but that got vetoed for some reason. So I do think there are certain outs, but that was like a brief gloss. And then Rossa is going to talk a little bit about some of the more kind of economic side of these indirect effects as well. So some other things that we're working on, again, things you might be familiar on, small probabilities of huge amounts of value, whether you treat them as the same as kind of medium amounts of, guarantees of smaller amounts of value, questions about discounting and discount rates. It's an obvious synergy between philosophy and economics. And also, again, something I'm very interested in is whether we should expect kind of moral convergence in the future, whether we should expect that all sufficiently good civilizations will just end up getting to the right place, or whether where we end up is very dependent on where we started from. It seems to me that's actually a kind of crucial issue on whether what you want to do is reduce extinction risk versus just making society better in various ways in terms of its institutions or values. OK, I'm going to, at that point, let Rossa give us a little bit of a taster of the sort of research that we're actually doing at GPI. Cool, awesome.
Cool, thanks very much, Will. So yeah, thanks very much for coming. I'm going to give an overview of a couple of examples of some of the areas of economics research we're interested in doing at GPI. One thing I'll note is that our research agenda is much broader than what we can talk about in 20 minutes. And so yeah, please do go on our website, check it out. And if you're interested in finding out more about the economic side of things, please come speak to me or Phil. I don't know if Phil's in the room, if he can stick his hand up. He's not in the room. That's cool. OK, so I'm going to talk about two different types of indirect effects and how we can use economic tools to try and estimate them. But I want to start off with some terminology. And basically because we often can end up talking past each other a bit, because different fields have slightly different terms for essentially the same things. So I want you to kind of think about there's some program or some intervention or some action, and we want to use some economic tools to estimate the costs and benefits of this program. So I'm going to call this program P. Now there's a direct effect to this program that we might want to estimate. I'm going to call this D here. And these are the effects of this program or action on the people or the outcomes that are targeted by this program. And economics is actually pretty good at estimating these direct effects. So that's the D there in this diagram on the right. But then there are indirect effects. And these are effects on people or outcomes that are not targeted by the program or intervention. And there's two types. So the first is spillover effects. And I think of these spillover effects as indirect effects over space. Or more concretely, normally you think of these spillover effects as effects of a program on people who didn't participate in a program. But there's a second set of effects which typically, I don't think we have a great name for this yet, but typically we talk about this as flow-through effects. And these are effects that occur either over longer time periods or on secondary outcomes. So outcomes that are not very proximate to the actual intervention or program that we kind of ran. So the reason GPI is interested in trying to estimate these effects is because they're potentially very important. So if you're trying to weigh up the costs and benefits of an action or a program or an intervention, taking into account these indirect effects is super important for whether you might want to do that or not. So to just give a concrete example, two of the major reasons that GiveWell still recommends deworming treatments is because there's evidence that they have spillover effects on non-treated people, and because there's evidence that they have these long-run flow-through effects. So there's a couple of papers which show that people who are dewormed when they were children have greater later life income. So there's papers on that in Kenya and also based on the eradication programs in the US in the 1920s. So economics is good at estimating these direct effects D, but we're not typically as good at estimating these spillover effects or these flow-through effects. So I'm going to talk to you today about essentially ways GPI is trying to address this in our research. So I'm going to start with spillover effects. And yeah, the motivation here is that effects of the program and non-participants can be very important in analyzing the overall effects of this intervention or program. But there's two key challenges here in trying to estimate these spillover effects. The first is that, well, it's often not obvious who is affected or where they are. So as a researcher, you want to estimate these spillover effects, but you need to make a decision about who you should ask or where you should ask them about the effects of some intervention. And the second is the effects per person might be quite small. So even though the overall spillover effect might be large, they might be spread out over a large population. And so statistically, it's very hard to detect these spillover effects if they're small but spread out over a large population. So these are the two key challenges that we face in estimating these spillovers. So the intuition as to how economists try and do this at the moment is kind of similar to the intuition as to how we use randomized controlled trials to estimate direct effects. So as I'm sure the majority of people are aware, the idea behind a randomized controlled trial is that you randomly assign individuals to the treatment group or the control group. And then you compare outcomes in each group. And the difference in the outcomes that you observe can be seen as the causal direct effect of this treatment. The idea being that because we randomly allocated people to treatment or control, they should be similar in other ways, apart from the fact that some of them got the treatment and others didn't. Now, the intuition is similar for how economists try to estimate spillover effects. But now we want exogenous or random variation in the intensity of treatment among an individual's neighbors. So for example, we want random variation in the proportion of someone's neighbors that participate in a program or an intervention. So essentially what we do is we compare individuals that have lots of treated neighbors to individuals that have few treated neighbors. And this comparison gives us an estimate of the spillover effect of the treatment. So for example, if me and Will live in different villages, and Will's village has 80% of people getting a deworming treatment, and my village only has 20% of people randomly assigned to get this deworming treatment, then we expect the spillover effects of the treatment to be bigger in Will's village. And so when we compare our outcomes, this tells us something about the spillover effects of this treatment. So there's two ways that we typically try to estimate these spillovers. The first is what I call the radius approach. And this was first used in relatively famous deworming papers. So famous in the EA movement and famous within economics. And what they did here is this was a school-based mass deworming program. And so if you want to estimate the spillover effects for kids in school I, what the authors do is they define a 3-kilometer radius around school I. And suppose in this school there's 4 other schools within that 3 kilometers. Well, these schools are going to be randomly assigned to the treatment group or the control group. So before you do your randomization, school I could have 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 other schools randomly assigned to treatment or control within 3 kilometers. And essentially what you do is you take a school that has 3 of the 4 neighboring schools allocated to the control group, and you compare it to a school that has 3 or 4 out of the neighboring schools allocated to the treatment group. The idea here is that there's random variation in the intensity of treatment within this 3 kilometers. So by comparing the low intensity treatment village or school on the left-hand side with the high intensity treatment village on the right-hand side, this tells us something about the spillover effects of this program. So what happened in these studies? Well, this is this kind of famous paper. It was subject to kind of a reanalysis a couple of years ago. You guys may have seen like a bunch of blogs about worm wars. I basically took this diagram from the Center for Global Development. And basically, when you reanalyze all this data, it seems that there are spillover effects of deworming within 4 kilometers. So if you do a deworming program at a school, then there's some positive effects on health and school participation in the surrounding area up to about 4 kilometers. And this is like a big part of the reason why GiveWell recommends deworming. Okay, so the second example of how we estimate these spillover effects is using what we call a randomized saturation experiment. And the idea here is the same. We want exogenous or random variation in the intensity of treatment. But now people have kind of thought, well, if we're setting up an experimental design, why don't we directly randomize the intensity of treatment rather than doing it by geographic location? So there's a two-step experimental design here. In the first step, you take your data and you basically divide it into different groups. And this is normally by cities or by village or something similar. And then you randomly assign each group to a different saturation of treatment, where the saturation is the fraction of individuals that are offered treatment. So in a paper which was evaluating a job market program in France, they randomly assigned different cities in France to have either 0, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100% of eligible people to the treatment group rather than the control group. And in a second step of our experimental design, you randomly assign individuals to the treatment or control group according to the proportions that you drew in your first step. So if that's kind of a bit unclear, here's a kind of picture. So above, imagine we have these 5 cities in France. And here we have a city that was randomly assigned to get 0% of people assigned to treatment. And here's a city with 25% of people assigned to treatment. So this is the first step of our experimental design. And then our second step of the experimental design, if you look at a city which was randomly assigned to have a saturation of 25%, then we randomly assign individuals at that proportion. So here you can see that 25% of the people in a city are assigned to treatment, and 75% are assigned to control groups. And so again, the idea is that we compare non-treated people in low-intensity cities, so in a 0 or 25% group, and we compare their outcomes to non-treated people in high-intensity cities. And we think the spillover effects will be bigger in our high-intensity cities. So for those of you who have done a bit of econometrics or stats, essentially what we do is we estimate this regression. Where on the left-hand side, we have the outcomes of an individual I in group G. On the right-hand side, we have their assignment to treatment, ZIG, and we have the saturation or the proportion of people treated in their group. So beta 1 here gives us the average direct effects of treatment. So this is basically saying, on average, how different are the outcomes for someone who's assigned to the treatment group versus assigned to the control group. And beta 2 gives us the average spillover effect. So it says, on average, how different do we expect our outcomes to be if all of your neighbors are treated compared to if none of your neighbors are treated? And this gives us this estimate of the spillover effects. So I guess I started off this talk by saying we're not very good at estimating spillover effects. And now I've just shown you 2 ways that we can do it. So I guess the natural question is, like, are we actually good at this? The answer is we're getting better, but we still don't understand some crucial parts of this. So these methods make 2 assumptions that I'm going to explore a bit more, and it's related to some of the research I've been doing at GPI. So first assumption is that everyone complies with their random treatment status. So if you're randomly assigned to the treatment group, you take the treatment. And if you're randomly assigned to the control group, you don't take the treatment. And in a lot of cases, this actually isn't what happens. So if you randomly assign someone to get a treatment, often they can choose not to get that treatment. And in those situations, it turns out it's more difficult to estimate the spillover effects. The second assumption is that spillover effects only occur within a given geographic area. So I'll talk about these 2 assumptions and how we can kind of improve on these methods. Okay, so first challenge, I guess the way to set this scene and to give you some intuition is to discuss this kind of well-known result in economics that if you have a normal randomized control trial and you're trying to estimate the direct effects of the treatment, what you end up estimating is what's called a local average treatment effect. And this is the idea that you can only estimate the direct effect of treatment for this group of compliers. And these compliers are people that get treated if and only if they are assigned to treatment. So people who follow the treatment status that they're assigned. This is important for estimating the effects of scaling up a program. So imagine you're in a setting where you do this nice randomized controlled trial. You get your results, and then you think you're going to scale it up to a full country, or just basically scale it up to a much larger area. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is that when you did your randomized controlled trial, the people that complied with their treatment status, so the people that took the treatment when they're assigned to it, might be people with the highest valuation of that treatment. So now if we scale up this program and give the program to everyone in a country, we should expect the effects to be smaller, because now everyone's receiving the treatment and not just people who are self-selecting into the treatment who might happen to have a higher value for it. So this is a well-known result in economics, and we can correct our estimates for this, and we can take this into account when we're estimating the effects of a scale-up of a program. But with spillovers, it's less well understood how a similar type of problem affects your estimates. So the problem as stated is that if some people don't take the treatment, we can only estimate spillover effects for compliers who are affected by the treatment of other compliers. So this is a result I've shown in a couple of papers with some co-authors, and we're kind of working on how you kind of correct for this. The way to think about this is the simplest case is in a two-person network. So if myself and Will both get deworming, and when I get dewormed, there's some spillover benefit for Will, and when he gets dewormed, there's some spillover benefit for me. If we run these previously used methods, then we're only estimating the spillover effect in the case that both Will and I are compliers. And so this is going to change our estimates of what will happen to this program as we scale it up. As we're working on some methods to better understand essentially how to correct for this problem. So the second challenge is one of where spillovers occur. So both of these previous methods that I discussed assume that spillovers only occur within a given area. So the radius approach assumes that spillovers occur only within a radius and not outside of it. And the randomized saturation experiments assume that spillovers occur only within the groups that you defined at the beginning. But in many situations, this isn't a very realistic assumption. So in some settings, we expect spillovers to kind of gradually dissipate over space. And so we expect these assumptions to be violated. And these settings, I think that economic models can really help us understand these spillover effects. So the model will allow us to predict and estimate where spillovers will occur and on what variables they will affect. So another piece of research I'm working on evaluates cash transfer programs. And what we're doing is we're using a model of different villages and how economically integrated they are to try and estimate these spillover effects. The idea being that if you put some cash transfers in a village, you don't expect the spillovers to only occur within that village. And the spillovers will probably spread out to other villages depending on how economically integrated they are. And so you can try and estimate the economic integration of these nearby villages. The model will also tell you whether we expect effects to be larger or smaller for different types of goods. So typically economic theory will predict that the kind of price of non-tradables will increase more than the price of tradables because it's harder to trade non-tradable goods between different villages. Okay. So these are kind of a couple of research questions we're working on to try and improve methods for estimating these spillover effects. We're also estimating these flow-through effects, and the reason they're important is similar, but I would argue that they're potentially even more important for analyzing the overall costs and benefits of an interventional program. So to give you some examples, and I'm going to start with kind of flow-through effects that are kind of shorter term in nature, probably smaller in nature, but also easier to estimate. And I'm going to move through to kind of flow-through effects that are probably larger in their nature, but more difficult to estimate. So one example is, does deworming have an effect on later life income? As I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of studies that look at this. Do bed nets lead to changes in fertility rates? So that's not a program that's not an outcome that was directly targeted by bed nets, but it might have this flow-through effect on fertility rates. So David Rubin's done some work on this for GiveWell. Does saving a life today have effects in 100 years or more? So Carl Schulman wrote a nice blog post kind of looking into this question, I think, earlier this week. Can we change economic growth trajectories? This is a question we're interested in at GPI. For what kinds of actions do we expect effects to wash out over time rather than be persistent? So this is something, again, that we're very interested in, especially when we're thinking about long-termism, as Will mentioned. And then finally, I think this is very pertinent to EA at the moment, is how do very long-run effects of short-run interventions compare to very, or maybe not very small changes in existential risks, but some changes in existential risks. So how do we compare long-run effects of short-run interventions with changing probabilities of existential risks? So these are the type of examples of flow-through effects we're keen to try and understand better. Okay, so we've made some progress in empirical work on some of these questions. Over a 5 to 10 year time frame, we've got a lot better at doing long-run follow-ups of randomized controlled trials. So there's examples of this in deworming, in education, in cash transfers, and in targeting the ultra-poor programs. We've also got better at estimating kind of flow-through effects over the time frame of decades and centuries. So Hoyt-Bleakley has these cohort studies which looks at the eradication of malaria and hookworm in the Americas and the long-run effects on later life incomes. And then there's like this kind of subfield within economics which looks at economic history, which looks at the effects over hundreds of years, potentially, of for example, like institutions or different colonial experiences on development patterns today. But these studies are inherently backwards looking, and to some extent they're limited in scope. And a lot of the questions that effective altruists are interested in answering are forwards looking. And so we need to make progress on how we can predict long-run effects of our actions today. And this is where I think economic theory comes in. So I'll give you a few examples, and I'll talk about one of them in more detail. So first is, how can we use time series econometrics to help us understand which economic processes have persistent shocks? So this is something that's kind of well-known, there's well-developed theory in time series econometrics, and we're interested in kind of understanding which outcomes and which processes have persistent shocks and which ones wash out over time. We're also interested in using game theory and mechanism design tools, again, a well-developed literature in economics, but we're interested in using it to answer questions such as how will future generations react to actions that we take today? So if we try and implement something which has a policy which has a long-termist perspective, how will future generations react to that? There's also a question of how much we should value things that we kind of do that affect the future. So there's a big literature on discounting in both philosophy and economics. And I'm going to talk very briefly about economic growth and existential risk. So first, a bit of background on economic growth and growth theory. And I'll start off with a pitch of why sustained economic growth is really important. It can basically have massive effects. So this is the kind of beauty of compounding. So 2% growth for 100 years leads your economy to be 7 times as big. But 2% growth for 700 years leads your economy to be about 1 million times as big. So the compounding effects of 2% growth are just absolutely huge over medium to long run timeframes. Depends on your medium to long run. So growth theory recognizes this importance and tries to understand the drivers of growth. So the standard model we're taught at grad school and at undergrad is a neoclassical growth model. So here, output is a function of capital, labor, and technology, and long-run growth is essentially driven by technological change. But these models model technological change as essentially exogenous. There's nothing policymakers can do to change technological advances. So in the 80s and 90s, along came this new theory of endogenous growth theory. And this is something Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize for a couple of weeks ago now. And basically, these models model technological change explicitly. So it's about the accumulation of knowledge or innovation, and it's something that policies can have an effect on. So one of the policy prescriptions of these models is often like R&D subsidies to try and help us continue long-run growth. But there's this paper by Chad Jones, which I think is like very relevant to effective altruism, and he starts off in the abstract by making a statement. And he says some technologies save lives, others threaten lives, and how is growth theory altered when technologies involve life and death instead of just higher consumption? So he's taken these endogenous growth models and he's bringing life and death into the equation. So in his model, he kind of makes these 2 key innovations, and he adds 2 research sectors to the economy. The first is consumption research, where an economy can choose to invest in improving their production technology, so their output is going to be greater in the future. And the second is safety research. So there's some risk of death each period, and we can invest in reducing this risk of death through some research. And he basically shows that in these kind of stylized but very nice models, he tries to solve them for what the optimal growth path looks like. So how much should you invest in consumption research versus safety research? And there's 2 scenarios. They're very different, and they depend on key model parameters. So the first scenario is consumption growth. So if the marginal utility of consumption diminishes very slowly, then we essentially keep getting more and more utility by increasing our consumption. And the implication for this is that our share of investment in consumption should increase to 1. So as we grow over time, we get richer and richer, and we should keep investing more and more of our resources in improving our consumption technology and improving how much we can consume. So this is kind of the good scenario. The bad scenario we call safety growth. So here, if the marginal utility of consumption diminishes very quickly, then growing indefinitely doesn't add that much utility to society. And then the model predicts that the optimal growth path would be that the share of investment the share of investment in safety research increases to 1. So as we get richer, we should be investing more and more of our resources in safety research. So this is very pertinent to EA. So this is a paper we're really interested in. We've kind of played about with extending it a bit. So we had some PhD students who were visiting us last summer. So Danny Bresler, Leonard Stern, and Michael Wiebe kind of worked on this question and made some progress on it. And they're basically interested in 2 research questions. How is the optimal growth rate affected by existential risk? And what is the optimal amount of safety research? So the way they do this is they basically take this Jones model and they make some extensions to it. They further endogenize extinction risk, so it might depend on the level of consumption. It might depend on how much we invest in consumption, or it might depend on some stock of safety goods. So these are kind of innovations to the Jones model. They also played about with putting in technological maturity into the model. So at some point in the future, we reach some stage where existential risks go close to 0. And they've looked at implications of different discount rates and different theories of population ethics. OK, cool. So that's meant to be like a nice overview of a couple of research questions that we're interested in. And now I'm going to hand over to Andreas, who's going to discuss some philosophy research questions. Cool. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. So as Rossa said, I'm going to look somewhat deeply into an issue in philosophy, but to some extent at the intersection of philosophy and economics. So this is a question about the relationship between long-termism and risk aversion. So we'll imagine that I've set aside some resources and some time, and I want to devote these to doing as much good as possible. And some people have a view about how to do that. They endorse a view which we'll call long-termism, which says basically that if you're aiming to do the most good, you should try to beneficially influence the long-run future, for example, by reducing the risk of human extinction, as opposed to aiming at some short-term benefits, which might be more certain, but whose expected value with respect to the long-run future is negligible. And in making the case for long-termism, philosophers who endorse this view point out that the value of the future is potentially really, really large. So Nick Bostrom notes that if the Earth remains habitable for a further 1 billion years, with at least 1 billion people alive at any point in time, then the future could potentially contain a minimum of 10 to the power of 16 lives of normal duration, from which he infers that the expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1,000,000th of 1 percentage point is at least 100 times the value of 1 million human lives. So as this makes clear, the potential value of the future is supposed to be so great that even some act of mine, which has only a very, very small probability of preventing an existential catastrophe, ends up being assigned enormous expected value. And that's key when it comes to this case for long-termism, because the philosophers who endorse this view tend to agree that the likelihood that I'll be able to significantly impact the long-term future of humanity in this way is actually quite small. And that seems intuitive. The likelihood that something I do will be the thing that makes the difference between humanity going extinct within the next 100 years or spreading to the stars is surely tiny. It's very unlikely that I'm so very important. So let's suppose that my choice is between spending my time and resources in a way that carries a very, very small probability of preventing human extinction, or bringing about with certainty some short-term benefits whose impact on the long run is negligible. So long-termism instructs me to choose the former, to put all my eggs in the basket of trying to influence the long-run future. But if I go along with that, it seems like I'm devoting my scarce resources to something that almost certainly has no positive impact whatsoever, turning down an alternative that with certainty brings about modest benefits. And we might suspect that a person's appetite for risk makes a difference to whether they're happy to make that kind of trade-off, whether they're willing to give up the certainty of achieving some modest amount of good for a highly uncertain prospect that offers the chance of producing some enormously good result. And in particular, we might have a suspicion that agents who are risk-averse will be less willing to make this kind of trade-off, and hence less willing to endorse the prescriptions of long-termism. So if we assume that risk aversion is both rationally permissible and compatible with impartial benevolence, it's important to work out whether risk-averse agents, so understood, should in fact be more or less compelled by the case for long-termism than risk-neutral agents. And that's basically what I'm going to look at. It's pretty hard to give any firm and robust answers, and I'm mainly going to be working through some really simplified toy models. But I'm going to suggest that under some reasonable assumptions, risk aversion actually turns out to be a better friend to long-termism than risk neutrality. So I said earlier that you should assume I want to do the most good. And there are different ways you can interpret that. So one way you could interpret it is that I rank outcomes in terms of how much good I accomplish in those outcomes. And if you do think about the issue in this way, then it is very, very plausible that agents who are risk-averse, but who want to do the most good, should be less inclined than an otherwise similar risk-neutral agent when it comes to preferring these long shots that are focused on influencing the long-run future, as opposed to actions that yield short-term benefits with certainty or near certainty. So to see why, imagine that we represent my decision situation in terms of the matrix that's on the screen here. So I've got two actions, short-term focus, or STF, long-term focus, LTF. And the numbers in the cells here will indicate how much good I do. So if I choose STF, then with certainty I do a modest amount of good, which we'll call a value of 1. If I choose LTF instead, then with 99% probability I do no good at all, but with 1% probability I do a lot of good, 100 units of good. So the values here and the probabilities are obviously just for illustration, but given these stipulations, a risk-averse agent is going to prefer STF to LTF because STF yields the expected value of the latter with certainty, but involves no risk. By contrast, a risk-neutral agent is going to be indifferent between the two actions that are available. So that accords with this suspicion that risk-averse agents are going to be less willing to endorse long-termism. On the other hand, I think it's very hard to believe that anyone who is impartially benevolent to any significant extent is actually going to rank outcomes in this way, rank outcomes in terms of how much good they do. So consider, for example, a possible outcome in which I choose the long-term focus. I fail to do any good, but that's because the existential risks on which I focused were never in the offing. Instead, a glorious long-run future was always in the cards for us, regardless of what I was going to do. Compare that to an outcome in which I chose a short-term focus. I did quite a lot of good. I saved a number of lives, but then we went extinct within the next 100 years. It seems clear that I should prefer the former outcome, in which we don't go extinct very soon, although it's one in which I do no good, ex hypothesi. And anyone who would rather have the world burn than be ineffectual in their do-gooding seems narcissistic in the extreme. So insofar as you're impartially benevolent, you should rank outcomes, and you shouldn't rank outcomes in terms of how much good you do. So I'm going to, from now on, assume that when we rank outcomes, we rank them in terms of their agent-neutral value, how good they are from the point of view of the universe, so to speak. And I'm going to set aside this idea that agents might rank outcomes in terms of how much good they do. The observations we've gone through might nonetheless suggest that maybe this hunch we had about the relationship between risk aversion and long-termism was based on a mistake. So it might be true that risk-averse agents who are focused on doing the most good are less inclined to focus on the far future, but only if we understand such agents as ranking outcomes in terms of how much good they do, as opposed to their agent-neutral value. It's very easy to slip into modeling agents in this way, I guess, when we're considering agents who say that what they want to do is to do the most good. But I think it's clear that this isn't an acceptable way to ultimately rank outcomes. So might it be this thought that risk-averse agents are going to be resistant to long-termist conclusions? Could that just rest on this misguided approach to modeling altruistic agents? Well, that's basically what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. So we're now going to look at what risk aversion might have to tell us if we rank outcomes in terms of their agent-neutral value. And to begin exploring this question, I think it's useful to note that we can think of there as being two ways in which I might fail to do any good if I focus on the long-term future, but end up being completely ineffectual. So on the one hand, it's possible that nothing I do is necessary for a glorious long-run future. Maybe if I focus on the short term or just twiddle my thumbs, all of that comes along anyway, holding fixed the actions of other agents. The other possibility is that nothing I do is sufficient for us to enjoy a glorious long-run future. Maybe if we hold fixed the actions of all other agents, we're doomed and there's nothing that I can do about that. If we think about outcomes in terms of how much good I accomplish in those outcomes, we paper over this distinction because either of these failure modes involves me doing no good at all and so ends up being evaluated in the very same way. But if we switch to evaluating outcomes in terms of their agent-neutral value, how good they are from the point of view of the universe, then it turns out that which of these possibilities represents the more likely failure mode for the long-termist focus is very important in assessing how risk aversion impacts on someone's preferences between LTF and STF. And to see this, we're going to start by considering two simple stylized cases. In each of these, you're going to imagine that I'm uncertain about whether or not I could avert an extinction threat by choosing LTF. In each case, I'm going to be 99% certain that I won't avert such a threat by choosing LTF, and I'll have 1% credence that I would, in fact, avert such a threat by going in on the long term. By contrast, I will always be certain that I can do some amount of good by choosing the short-term focus. So here's the first case that I have in mind, which I'll imaginatively call case 1. So here we're almost certain that humanity will enjoy a glorious future. And again, I've got these two actions, short-term focus, long-term focus. And if I choose the long-term focus, it's guaranteed that there's a glorious long-run future. By contrast, if I choose the short-term focus, I'm guaranteed to do some small amount of good, but there is a 1% chance that we'll go extinct. And the values here, as I say, denote the agent-neutral value of outcomes, not how much good I accomplish. So in this sort of case, it's easy to see that whereas a risk-neutral agent is indifferent between the two acts, a risk-averse agent prefers LTF, prefers the long-term focus, because it yields with certainty the expected value of the uncertain prospect that's associated with choosing STF. By contrast, we'll consider case 2. So here it's almost certain that we go extinct very soon. And if I choose STF, then it is certain that we go extinct very soon, but obviously I get to sweeten our final hour just a little bit. By contrast, if I choose LTF, well, again, it's almost certain that I do no good at all. I don't even sweeten our final hour, but there's a very, very small chance that I avert extinction. So in this case, a risk-neutral agent will again be indifferent between the two actions that are available, but a risk-averse agent will prefer STF because this yields with certainty the expected value of the uncertain prospect associated with LTF. So here is a case in which risk aversion tells against the long-termist focus, even when we rank outcomes in terms of their agent-neutral value. So obviously these cases are really extreme. Remember that in case 1, I could be certain of a good long-run future if I chose the action LTF, and in this case 2, I can be certain that we'll go extinct very soon if I choose this other action STF. I'm pretty certain that we're in neither of these cases. So what can we say about more realistic cases? Is the situation that we're actually in one in which risk aversion tells for or against LTF or STF? So in order to examine this question and get a bit more realistic, we first need to choose a decision-theoretic interpretation of risk aversion, going beyond this basic idea on which we've so far been relying, that a risk-averse agent prefers to have some good with certainty as opposed to a gamble whose expected value is the same as that good. On the orthodox economic interpretation of risk aversion is equivalent to concavity of the agent's utility function in respect of the good, whose amounts define the relevant outcomes, or equivalently, this means that the agent exhibits diminishing marginal utility for increasing amounts of that good. I'm not going to work with this model because I'm convinced by the standard arguments against it, which I'll just very, very quickly list without hoping to convince anyone who thinks this is the only way to talk about risk aversion. But here are the sort of 3 standard arguments which I think are convincing. So on the one hand, there seems to be a sense in which the orthodox economic interpretation of risk aversion involves a category mistake. Just because I have diminishing marginal utility from some good doesn't mean that I'm afraid of risk. Those seem like 2 different things, my attitudes towards risks and my attitude towards certain outcomes. Consequently, there are behavioral phenomena that can't be captured by the standard economic interpretation of risk aversion, most famously the standard preferences that people exhibit in the so-called Allais paradox. Now, all of this might seem a bit like it's quibbling about semantics. Defenders of the orthodoxy might insist that what I want to call risk aversion, they will choose to call irrationality. What seals the deal for me is a well-known calibration theorem due to Matthew Rabin, which shows that if I'm counted as reasonably risk-averse in respect of modest stakes, then the orthodox interpretation requires me to be absurdly risk-averse over large stakes. So in particular, Rabin points out that if I always reject a 50-50 gamble on losing $100 or gaining $110, then if I'm also an expected utility maximizer and can be modeled within the standard microeconomic approach, I would also have to turn down a 50-50 gamble on losing $1,000 or gaining any amount of money. So the kind of problems that we're interested in are ones that involve very, very large stakes. So we don't want a theory of risk aversion that goes haywire when large stakes are in play, or else rules out significant degrees of risk aversion in modest stakes, where we can better test our intuitions about the rational permissibility or ethical permissibility of risk aversion. So I'm going to do without the standard economic interpretation. Instead, I'm going to work with the theory of risk-weighted expected utility theory, developed by Lara Buchak. So formally, this is equivalent to rank-dependent utility theory as developed by Quiggin, but the theory differs in its philosophical interpretation of the formalism. So under risk-weighted expected utility, risk aversion can be understood as a matter of how the agent evaluates structural properties of gambles and therewith trades off the competing virtues of prudence and venturesomeness in the pursuit of her aims. So we assume that in addition to a utility function U and a probability function P, the agent can also be represented as having a non-decreasing risk function R, which maps the unit interval to itself. And we assume that this risk function at least must have the following properties. So R of P of E equals 0 if P of E equals 0, and also R of P of E equals 1 if P of E equals 1. Other than that, there's lots of room for agents to vary in terms of what kind of risk function they have. And so in particular, one thing that's really crucial here is that we can describe agents as risk avoidant in respect of some range of probabilities if the risk function is a convex function, like R of P equals P squared, on that range of probabilities. By contrast, the agent is what's described within this theory as globally neutral if the risk function is a linear function. And that just gives us the famous or the familiar expected utility maximizer that we know and love. So in order to define the risk-weighted expected utility of a gamble, G, with finitely many outcomes, we represent the gamble in terms of a probability distribution over this set here. So E1, X1, E2, X2, and we'll imagine that X1 is the outcome that arises if event E1 occurs, X2 is the outcome that arises if E2 obtains, and so on and so forth. We assume that these outcome event pairs are ordered in such a way that the utility of X1 is no greater than the utility of X2, which is no greater than the utility of X3, and so on all the way up to U of Xn. With all that in place, the risk-weighted expected utility of a gamble is then defined by this giant unwieldy formula here. So just by way of explanation, the thought is that agents evaluate gambles by first considering the worst possible outcome, and then you're evaluating potential improvements over and above that worst possible outcome that's available within a gamble. And each possible improvement is assessed in terms of the risk-weighted probability of achieving an improvement that's at least that great. So, for example, when we've got the risk-weighted utility of the gamble G here, so we start by taking the utility of the worst possible outcome, so that's U of X1. We then consider the next sort of step up that's available within this gamble. So you can trade up from X1 to X2, so that's the next worst outcome. You consider the difference between their utility values here, and then you multiply that by, well, you take the probability of attaining an outcome that's at least as good as X2, and then you take the risk-weighted probability instead of the straightforward probability as you would do under the orthodox utility maximizing approach. And then you just keep going on and up, considering improvements and taking the risk-weighted probability of achieving an outcome that's at least as good as the next improvement available. As well as this risk-weighted expected utility theory, we're going to work with the following generalized decision matrix as opposed to the other ones that we've been working with so far. So once again, we assume that there are two actions, which we call STF and LTF, and we now assume that there are three possible states of the world. One of these is that we're just doomed, so no matter what I do, we go extinct very soon. Another possibility is that we enjoy a glorious future if I choose LTF, but we go extinct otherwise. So everything really hinges on me. This is the very unlikely scenario. And then the final, much more likely scenario is that no matter what I do, we'll enjoy a glorious future. So actually, I don't actually need to do anything. If I just sit and twiddle my thumbs, it'll all be fine. So I've introduced some variables to represent these probabilities, which you can see on the screen. I've also introduced some variables to represent the value of the outcomes or the utilities of the outcomes. So those are the ones you see there. And I'm going to make some assumptions about these values. So in particular, I will assume that W is greater than X, which is greater than Y, which is greater than Z. What that means is that the outcome that arises, if we enjoy a glorious future and I also achieved a bunch of significant short-term benefits because I chose STF, that's the outcome we'll call W, that's better than the outcome in which we achieved the glorious long-run future, but I didn't get those significant short-term benefits because I was putting all my action into LTF, which in turn is better than the outcome in which I do some short-term good, but then we go extinct very soon, which in turn is better than the outcome in which I don't do any short-term good and we go extinct very soon, which would be bad. I'm also going to assume that the difference between W and Y is as great as the difference between X and Z. Basically, that means that the benefits that are achieved, if I choose STF, don't diminish or increase according to how long the long-run future is. So that's supposed to accord with the assumption that the short-term goods I can achieve have a negligible impact on the long run. And lastly, just to keep things a bit cleaner, I'm going to denote this fraction W minus X over X minus Z as lambda. So basically, lambda represents the ratio of the improvement achieved by producing short-term benefits via STF to the improvement that would be achieved if I were to avert extinction through the choice of LTF. So if you do a bit of calculation, it turns out that globally neutral agents who maximize expected utility, and their utility is defined in respect of agent neutral value, they prefer to focus on the long-term future just in case P1 is greater than lambda. In other words, the probability that my efforts are both necessary and sufficient to prevent extinction must be greater than the ratio of the improvement that's achieved if from STF versus that would be achieved from LTF if choosing LTF were to avert extinction. By contrast, risk-avoidant agents will strongly prefer the short-term focus just in case you have that lambda is greater than R of P1 plus P2 minus R of P2. So one thing that's somewhat notable here is that globally neutral agents can determine which alternative is most preferable just by thinking about the value of P1, whereas risk-avoidant agents need to think about the values of P1 and P2. In any case, we find that risk-avoidant and globally neutral agents are going to disagree in their priorities, with the former preferring STF and the latter preferring LTF, just in case this equation 1 is true. And it's straightforward to see that this equation 1 will be true only if this other equation 2 is going to be true. So I think that studying the properties of this equation 2 can be useful in terms of thinking about the conditions under which risk-avoidant and globally neutral agents could, in principle, disagree in their priorities. And to make things even simpler, I'm going to assume for simplicity that the risk avoidance risk function, R of P, just squares probability. So R of P equals P squared. In that case, this equation 2 reduces to the equation that you see here, equation 3. Now, if P1 is very small, and remember that P1 is this the event that basically whether or not we have a glorious long-run future depends uniquely on what I do. So that we'll assume that that's a very, very, very small value. And if it's very small, then this equation is going to be satisfied just in case P2 is appreciably smaller than 1/2. Is that plausible? Well, recall that P2 is the likelihood that we'll have a glorious future, even if my efforts to influence the long term are entirely ineffectual. So it's just in the cards. And just to think about this, let's assume, as we've been doing, that it's basically very, very, very unlikely that I will influence the long run. And we'll also assume that the next few centuries represents what Derek Parfit called the hinge of history. So this is a dangerous and decisive period, the survival of which would ensure a good future in which our descendants have the power to spread throughout the Virgo supercluster, or whatever the good future looks like to you. Then, for simplicity, we could set P2 roughly equal to the probability that humanity will not go extinct within the next few hundred years. Now, a view that assigns more than 50% probability to humanity going extinct within that time frame is quite pessimistic, but it's not without adherents. So in particular, Martin Rees effectively holds this view. He said in a 2003 book that the odds are no better than 50-50 that our present civilization on Earth will survive to the end of the present century. Of course, satisfying this equation 2 is just a necessary condition for equation 1 to be satisfied, which is what you actually need in order for there to be a genuine conflict between risk-avoidant and globally neutral agents. In order for 1 to be satisfied, you also need the value of lambda to fit between P1 and R of P1 plus P2 minus R of P2. And it's my impression that philosophers who endorse long-termism generally regard P1 as greater than lambda by several orders of magnitude, which would mean that this equation is not going to be satisfiable under any really plausible assumptions. So we focused here on the case where risk-avoidant agents might focus on the short term, whereas globally neutral expected utility maximizing agents focus on the long term. To wrap up, we'll just focus on the converse possibility. So risk-avoidant agents are going to strongly prefer the long term, while globally neutral agents weakly prefer the short term, just in case this equation 4 is satisfied, and that equation is satisfied just in case this equation 5 is satisfied. And if we simplify again and assume that R of P equals P squared, then that equation 5 was going to be satisfied just in case P2 is appreciably greater than 1/2. And many who've thought about the issue of near-term extinction provide estimates of P2, on which that looks very, very plausible. So John Leslie, for example, has suggested that there's a 70% chance that our species will survive the next 5 centuries. Toby Ord has suggested that the probability that we'll survive the next century is about 5/6. And in general, it looks like estimates of extinction risk within the next century of between 15 and 25% seem to have much broader support than Rees's very pessimistic estimate, on which there's at least a 50% probability that civilization will be snuffed out. Now, of course, those who endorse long-termism think that the equation 4 is not going to be satisfied in any case because they think P1 is much, much greater than lambda. But even so, I think the following is a notable conclusion. If risk-avoidant and globally neutral agents were to disagree in their priorities between STF and LTF, a conflict on which the risk-avoidant agents prefer the long term and the expected utility maximizers prefer the short term is more plausible as a scenario than the converse, given our assumptions about which risk functions and which estimates of these probability values are most reasonable. And I'll end there. Thank you.